Welcome to human and time. Settle into whatever place feels comfortable and let the world around you grow a little quieter. If these journeys through the lives and landscapes of the past bring you some peace, you can gently support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. And now, without hurrying, we can leave the present behind. Long before anyone would remember him as an old man with a strange face and an even stranger habit of asking questions, Socrates was simply a child in Attica. He was born around 470 or 469 BC into a city that was still learning what it might become. His home belonged to the deme of Alopeak, one of the local communities that formed the civic world of Athens. Beyond the clustered houses, paths moved through the dry Attic landscape beneath a wide sky. Olive trees stood where the soil permitted them. Dust gathered on roads in the long, rainless months. In the cooler seasons, rain darkened the earth and softened the stone. The air carried the familiar sense of smoke, oil, bread, animals, and soil warmed by the sun. Athens itself lay close enough to shape every stage of his life. The great struggle against Persia belonged to the recent memory of the city. Men older than Socrates had lived through the danger and the survival that followed. The generation into which he was born inherited not only stories of war, but a confidence that was beginning to change the physical face of Athens. Over the decades ahead, the city would become richer, more ambitious, more crowded with public life. Buildings would rise on the Acropolis. The Agora would fill each day with trade, politics, legal business, labor, gossip, worship, argument, and ordinary human need. But none of this would have seemed like history to the boy growing up at Alopeak. It would simply have been home. His father was called Socrates. Later tradition would connect the family with stonework and sculpture, though the claim that Socrates himself became a sculptor, or that particular statues on the Acropolis were his work, is too uncertain to treat as fact. His mother was Phanerete. In Plato's account, she was a midwife, a woman whose work stood at one of the most intimate thresholds of ordinary life, entering households when a new human being was about to arrive. Much later, Plato would make something memorable from this family detail. His Socrates would compare his own activity to a kind of midwifery, not of bodies but of minds, helping other people bring their thoughts into the open and discover whether those thoughts could live. But in the beginning, there is no need to look so far ahead. For now there is only a household, a child, and a city beyond the door. Athenian homes did not resemble the pale, monumental world that survives in ruined stone. Domestic life was smaller, warmer, more crowded with work. Food had to be prepared. Water had to be fetched. Grain had to be ground. Cloth had to be woven. Storage jars stood against walls or in working spaces. Smoke from cooking mixed with the smell of oil and bread. Wooden doors opened onto courtyards and rooms where light changed throughout the day. The rhythms of a household were divided by status, age, gender, and necessity. Women and household slaves could spend long hours in textile work, food preparation, water carrying, and the practical management that kept a family alive. Children grew inside these sounds before they understood the larger city around them. The scrape of a grinding stone, the movement of a loom, ceramic vessels placed on hard surfaces, low voices passing between rooms. If Socrates woke early as a boy, he would have entered a world already in motion. Somewhere, bread was being prepared. Somewhere, a jar was being lifted. Outside, sandals struck packed earth and stone. The morning light of Attica arrived cleanly across walls and rooftops, revealing dust suspended in the air. In the distance, Athens waited. There is very little we can say with certainty about the private details of his childhood, and that silence matters. No childhood diary survived. No school exercise bears his name. No family letter describes his temperament. The man who would later become one of the most discussed figures in philosophy left us not even a line written in his own hand. So we should not invent a clever boy asking impossible questions beneath an olive tree. We can instead stay with what his world makes likely. A male Athenian child of his position would probably have received the basic education expected of a citizen: reading and writing, music, and physical training. Literacy among Athenian males had become increasingly common before his childhood, and instruction existed for boys whose families could provide it. The purpose was not to create a philosopher. It was to form someone capable of living inside the civic and cultural life of the city. Letters were marks to be learned. Poetry was something to be heard and remembered. Music trained the ear as well as the character, and the body, too, belonged to education. A boy grew toward citizenship knowing that citizenship was not an abstract privilege. It carried obligations. At around 18, young Athenian men entered the civic register of their deme and moved toward the military responsibilities expected of adult male citizens. Long before Socrates became famous for standing in discussion, he belonged to a society in which a citizen might also be required to stand in a line of armed men. For the moment, however, the shield can remain in the future. The young Socrates was growing while Athens changed around him. To reach the city from Alopeak was to move toward an increasingly dense human world. The roads brought people from surrounding demes and countryside into the urban center. Farmers, craftsmen, traders, citizens conducting public business, foreigners, enslaved people, and visitors all passed through the city's spaces. Animals moved with them. Goods arrived in baskets, jars, bundles, and carts. The soundscape thickened as the day advanced. At the heart of much of this activity was the Agora, and it was far more than a marketplace. The open space and the buildings around it belonged to the machinery of Athenian life. Public records could be displayed there. Official weights and measures regulated exchange. Government buildings stood nearby. Juries, magistrates, citizens, craftsmen, buyers, and sellers all had reasons to pass through. Workshops and houses pressed close to civic space. Religion did not stand apart from commerce or politics. Sacred places existed within the same living landscape. A person could come to buy food and hear political argument. He could pass a craftsman shaping material with practiced hands, then encounter a public notice carved or written for citizens to read. He could see a man carrying a jar from a fountain and another preparing for legal business. Nothing needed to be arranged into separate subjects. The city performed all of them at once. Water moved quietly beneath much of this activity. Athens depended on systems of fountains, terracotta pipes, stone drains, wells, and channels. Some of the waterworks serving the Agora had begun before Socrates was born. Others developed as the city did. Water did not announce itself as infrastructure. It appeared as the heavy jar someone carried home, the sound of a fountain, the dampness around a basin, the brief coolness of wet clay against the hand. In a dry landscape, such things were never trivial. Perhaps this is one of the easiest ways to enter Socrates. Athens without turning it into a lesson. Stand beside the fountain for a moment and listen to the water. A woman or household servant approaches with a vessel. Someone else moves aside. A trader walks past, calling attention to his goods. A dog slips through the edge of the crowd. Nearby, men talk about matters that seem urgent because all present life seems urgent while it is being lived. The Acropolis rises above them, but no one needs to look at it every moment. Monumental things become ordinary when they belong to the horizon of your childhood. For Socrates, the Acropolis was not an archaeological site. It was part of the sky. During his youth and early adulthood, the city's great building projects transformed that height. Stone was quarried, carried, shaped, fitted, painted, and raised. The Parthenon would rise during his lifetime. What later centuries would preserve as a symbol of classical Athens first existed as labor dust on skin, tools against stone, measurements, ropes, wood, sweat, voices, and the slow placement of one block upon another. The city was building an image of permanence, while one of its future critics walked somewhere below. He did not yet look like the marble heads later generations would copy. Indeed, even the familiar sculpted face through which we often imagine Socrates belongs to a portrait tradition created after his death and preserved in Roman copies. Yet the literary sources agree on something more useful than exact measurements. Socrates was remembered as physically unusual. His eyes were prominent. His nose was broad or turned upward. His lips were heavy. His face did not match the graceful ideals celebrated in elite Greek beauty. Later, he would joke about it. Later still, Plato would compare him to a Silenus figure, rough and comic on the outside, concealing something precious within. But youth does not remain still long enough for later descriptions to capture it. The body changes. The city changes. Even marble changes under weather. What seems more consistent across the traditions is the adult habit of simplicity that Socrates would come to embody. He was not remembered as a man of display. He did not present himself in costly fashion. Accounts emphasize plain clothing, bare feet, physical endurance, and an indifference to comforts that mattered greatly to many others. This simplicity should not be mistaken for the life of a homeless beggar. Socrates was an Athenian citizen. He would serve as a hoplite. He married and had children. He belonged to a household. Yet by the standards of men concerned with wealth and status, he cultivated a remarkably modest way of living. That contrast must have been especially visible in Athens. The city around him was becoming a place where public reputation mattered intensely. Men spoke before other citizens. Political influence could rise or vanish. Skilled rhetoric could shape a judgment. Wealth purchased comfort and display. Fine ceramics moved through dining rooms. Symposium guests reclined on couches while wine, diluted with water, passed from a mixing bowl into cups. Music, poetry, laughter, competition, and conversation filled elite evenings. Elsewhere, the ordinary diet was simpler. Grain remained fundamental. Barley and wheat became bread or other preparations. Olives, vegetables, legumes, fruit, cheese, fish, and wine belonged to the larger food world of Athens, while meat was less ordinary and often connected with sacrifice. Wine was commonly mixed with water. Olive oil touched cooking, food, light, skin, and trade. Smell becomes a way of understanding the distance between a polished idea of classical Athens and the city in which Socrates actually lived. The Agora could smell of fish and smoke, of oil, garlic, and onions, animals and human bodies, wine spilled or poured, warm pottery, and dust. In summer, the heat gathered on stone and earth. In the wetter months, rain darkened surfaces and brought the smell of damp soil into streets and courtyards. Himation cloth could be drawn closer around the body when the air cooled. The same city could feel white and glaring under a dry sky, then muted and heavy after rain. Socrates grew into adulthood beneath these changes of season. By the time he approached the age at which an Athenian man fully entered civic obligations, he belonged not merely to a family, but to a deme, a tribe, and a polis that expected things from him. Alope connected him to the tribe Antiochus. The names mattered because Athenian citizenship was built from these smaller affiliations. One did not simply announce oneself as a citizen of a grand abstraction called Athens. Citizenship was recorded through local belonging and expressed through participation, obligation, and service. At around 18, the world widened. Military expectation waited beyond adolescence. Civic life was no longer something performed only by older men in the distance. The young citizen was becoming one of the people upon whom the city might call. And still the Agora remained there. One of the temptations in telling Socrates' life is to make every road lead immediately toward philosophy. as though the child had been born beneath a sign pointing toward his trial in 399. But real lives are not lived backward. A young Socrates did not know that Plato would write dialogues about him. He did not know that Aristophanes would place a comic version of him on stage. He did not know that one day hundreds of fellow citizens would vote on whether he should die. His future had not yet become memory. There were only days. There were walks into the city. There were public festivals and sacrifices, meals and military duties. Conversations whose words disappeared as soon as they were spoken. There were buildings still unfinished, and faces later forgotten. The Athens of his youth was not quiet, but neither was it permanently dramatic. Most hours contained no famous event. Men worked, women managed households. Children carried out tasks and learned the habits expected of them. Craftsmen shaped wood, metal, clay, and stone. Traders argued over value. Water was fetched. Fires were lit. Bread was broken. The sun moved from one side of the courtyard to the other. And somewhere among these ordinary movements, a mind was changing. We cannot identify the afternoon on which Socrates first became recognizably Socrates. There is no preserved moment when he stepped into the Agora, stopped a passerby, and began the manner of questioning that would later make him famous. His philosophical life emerges from the sources already grown. By the time we see him clearly, he speaks with men from different levels of society, refuses payment for conversation, questions claims to wisdom, and draws young listeners around him. But the road to that public figure is partly hidden. That hiddenness can be allowed to remain. It is enough to notice the world from which his questions would eventually arise. Athens was a city crowded with people who claimed different kinds of knowledge. A craftsman knew his craft. A politician claimed judgment about the city. A poet possessed language and reputation. Teachers and intellectual figures moved through the Greek world, some offering instruction in rhetoric and argument for payment. Among them, the people later grouped under the name sophists became especially visible in the intellectual life of the 5th century. Socrates would resemble them in ways that confused his contemporaries. He, too, spoke with young men. He, too, examined language and arguments. He, too, could leave people uncertain about beliefs that had seemed secure. Yet the portrait preserved by Plato and Xenophon insists on an important difference. Socrates did not charge a fee for his conversations and denied that he possessed a body of knowledge that he sold as instruction. That difference would matter later. For now, imagine only that the city is becoming more talkative. Public life depended on speech. Legal cases depended on speech. Politics depended on speech. Reputation traveled by speech. Stories about other people traveled faster still. In such a city, a man who asked questions could become more disruptive than a man who merely offered answers. But Socrates was not yet the old figure in the marketplace. The middle decades of the 5th century were still opening before him. The Acropolis above the city became more imposing. The Agora continued to collect the daily traffic of Athenian life. Athens grew in confidence and power across the Aegean. Its citizens could look at the stone rising above them and feel that their city occupied a special place in the world. Yet greatness has weight. A powerful city requires money, ships, labor, alliances, administration, soldiers, and the willingness to defend what it has become. For the young citizen of Alapeak, these were not philosophical abstractions. One day they would become a bronze shield on his arm. Before that day, there were still quieter moments, perhaps a meal of bread, olives, cheese, or vegetables eaten without ceremony, perhaps diluted wine in a simple cup. Perhaps the coolness of a shaded wall after walking through a hot street, perhaps evening light touching the upper stone of the city while lower lanes fell into shadow. We do not need to place invented words in his mouth to feel the questions gathering around him. What does a city owe its citizens? What does a citizen owe his city? What makes a person worthy of respect? Is reputation the same as goodness? Can someone possess wealth and still neglect what matters most? Can someone speak beautifully and still know nothing? These are questions associated with the mature Socratic world, not documented thoughts from his childhood. Yet the Athens in which he grew offered them in physical form long before anyone preserved them in dialogue. Wealth passed through the Agora beside poverty. Beauty was carved into public stone beside faces that did not fit its ideal. Citizens celebrated freedom while preparing for war. Men praised wisdom while disagreeing about almost everything that wisdom required. The city itself contained contradictions. Socrates would eventually learn to stand inside contradictions and refuse to leave too quickly. His method, as later sources present it, did not begin with long speeches. He asked. Another person answered. A second question followed, then another. Gradually, certainty could begin to loosen. A definition that seemed obvious became difficult to defend. Courage, justice, piety, virtue, knowledge, words everyone used, could become strange when someone patiently asked what they actually meant. But there is time enough for those conversations later. The first part of his life belongs to becoming. A boy becomes a citizen. A household becomes one small part of an expanding city. A city becomes a power. Stone becomes a temple. Speech becomes politics. And beyond the walls, the Greek world grows less settled. By the time Socrates reached his 30s, Athens had already changed profoundly from the city into which he had been born. The confidence of its public spaces, the grandeur of its building, and the intensity of its civic life existed beside increasing rivalry and danger. The long conflict that would dominate the adult years of Socrates had not yet consumed the city, but its shadow was drawing nearer. The citizen who would later become famous for questioning courage would soon have to carry weapons. The man remembered for indifference to cold would soon spend winters away from home. The philosopher associated with death would first meet death not in a prison, but in the ordinary obligation of military service. For now, the city can remain in the last light before that change. The agora thins as work slows. Footsteps become easier to distinguish from the general murmur. A jar is carried home. A workshop is closed. Smoke rises from cooking fires behind domestic walls. Above the city, the stone of the Acropolis holds the fading warmth of the day. Somewhere among the returning citizens walks Socrates, no longer a child, not yet the old man of memory. He moves through streets he has known for years, and Athens, still bright with confidence, is moving with him toward a war neither man nor city can yet see in full. And beyond the last houses, where the familiar roads of Attica stretched toward country fields and distant hills, the obligations of citizenship were becoming harder to ignore. Athens had spent years learning to think of itself as a city of unusual power. Its ships crossed the Aegean. Tribute and goods moved through the world connected to its influence. On the Acropolis, stone rose into forms that seemed capable of resisting time itself. Yet power creates boundaries, and boundaries create rivals. Far from the workshops and fountains of the Agora, other Greek cities watched Athens with suspicion, resentment, fear, or ambition of their own. Among them stood Sparta. The struggle that followed would not be one brief campaign, nor a single summer remembered for one decisive battle. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BC and, with interruptions and changing fortunes, would continue until 404. Socrates was about 38 when it began. By the time it ended, he would be an old man in his mid-60s. Nearly the whole middle portion of his life would unfold beneath its shadow. But even before the war formally began, Socrates had already been sent north. In 432 BC, Athens was drawn into conflict at Potidaea, a city on the Chalcidice Peninsula that had rebelled against Athenian control. An Athenian force was dispatched, and among the hoplites serving there was Socrates. The transformation from the streets of Athens to an army on campaign must have been physical before it was philosophical. A hoplite did not travel as a detached observer. His equipment had weight. Bronze, wood, cloth, leather, weapons, supplies, all belonged to the body now moving far from home. The shield alone changed the way a man occupied space. He was part of a formation and part of a civic obligation larger than his private preferences. Socrates was no longer merely a man who might spend his time talking in public places. Here he was one Athenian among other Athenians, walking north because the city required him to go. The dry Attic landscape disappeared behind them. Roads and sea routes carried the expedition away from the familiar profile of Athens. The climate of northern Greece could offer conditions different from those of Attica, and the campaign at Potidaea would not end quickly. The city was placed under siege. Months became years. Seasons turned while soldiers remained away from their households. War often enters later memory as movement. Armies marching, shields colliding, cities falling, but siege contains long stretches in which very little appears to happen. Men wait. They eat what can be obtained. They maintain equipment. They sleep. They watch. They endure weather. They hear rumors. They grow accustomed to faces that may not be there a week later. Fires burn in camps as darkness settles over unfamiliar ground. For Socrates, Potidaea would become one of the places from which later stories about his unusual endurance emerged. In Plato's Symposium, the account is placed in the mouth of Alcibiades, the brilliant and deeply complicated Athenian who had served there with him. Alcibiades remembers Socrates enduring hardship with remarkable ease. When food was scarce, he seemed able to tolerate hunger better than others. When provisions were plentiful, he could enjoy them without appearing dependent upon them. He was remembered as unusually resistant to cold, walking in conditions that made other soldiers wrap themselves heavily, and doing so with the same plain habits that already marked him at home. It is a portrait preserved through Plato, and so it should remain what it is, a remembered portrait, not a military report. Yet it fits the broader image of Socrates remarkably well. The body that later Athenians would see moving barefoot through their city had already been tested far from its stones. Perhaps more striking still is another episode Alcibiades recalls. At Potidaea, he says, Socrates once became absorbed in thought and remained standing in one place for an extraordinary length of time. Other soldiers noticed. The hours passed. Some watched him out of curiosity. According to the story, he remained standing through the night until dawn, when he finally offered a prayer to the sun and went on his way. There is no need to explain what happened inside his mind. Plato does not give us the thought itself. That absence is almost more fitting. Around him, a military camp continued its ordinary existence. Men ate, rested, complained, slept, woke. The air cooled after sunset. Fires weakened. Darkness settled over the camp, and somewhere among them stood one man, motionless beneath the changing sky. Stars crossed overhead without requiring an interpretation. By dawn, the horizon brightened. Socrates moved again. The story is easy to turn into mysticism, but it is better left quiet. Ancient sources repeatedly associate him with unusual powers of concentration and physical endurance. We do not need to decide more than that. War, meanwhile, did not pause for contemplation. The siege continued, and with it came something that was spreading through the Athenian world with far less visibility than an army. In 430 BC, disease struck Athens. The epidemic described by Thucydides became one of the most devastating experiences of the war. Crowded conditions inside the city helped turn illness into catastrophe. People sickened in enormous numbers. Social customs were strained by fear and death. Pericles himself would eventually die during the epidemic. Yet Socrates should not be imagined walking through plague-stricken Athenian streets at this moment. He was still connected to the campaign at Potidaea, and the disease did not remain behind the city walls. Thucydides records that it reached the Athenian forces at Potidaea as well. A reinforcement expedition of 4,000 hoplites suffered terribly. Within roughly 40 days, more than 1,000 of those newly arrived soldiers had died, and the troops already stationed there were affected too. We do not know that Socrates contracted the disease. We do not know what cases he personally witnessed. We know only that the epidemic entered the military environment in which he was serving. That is enough. A camp already accustomed to waiting now contained another uncertainty. Illness did not approach in formation. No shield could stop it. No courage could guarantee safety. A man could be healthy, then fevered, present at one meal, absent from another. For someone whose later conversations would repeatedly circle around knowledge and the limits of human certainty, the world itself was offering no shortage of reminders that certainty was fragile. But we should resist making the young soldier into the old philosopher too soon. He still had a campaign to survive. The most famous Potidaea story involving Socrates concerns Alcibiades. In Plato's telling, Alcibiades was wounded in battle, and Socrates helped save both the young man and his armor. Alcibiades claims that Socrates deserved the award for valor, though Socrates favored him for the honor instead. Again, we are listening to Alcibiades as Plato presents him many years later at a drinking party. The scene comes to us through memory shaped into literature. But the historical connection between the two men was real enough to become one of the most consequential associations in Socrates' life. For now, Alcibiades was young, aristocratic, beautiful, ambitious, and full of possibilities no one around him could yet measure. The later betrayals, political reversals, scandals, and disasters attached to his name were still in the future. At Potidaea, he was simply another Athenian under arms, and Socrates was beside him. Eventually the campaign ended. The men who returned to Athens came back to a city changed by war and disease. The streets were familiar, but familiarity does not prevent a place from becoming different while one is away. Some households had lost members. Some political voices had disappeared. The war remained. Yet ordinary life continued with the quiet stubbornness that ordinary life always seems to possess. The fountains still had to provide water. Workshops still opened. Grain still had to be prepared. Ships still arrived. Cases still came before courts. Men still argued in public. Children still grew. The Acropolis remained above the city, its stone indifferent to how many names had vanished from households below. Socrates returned to this world not as a legendary philosopher descending from a campaign, but as a citizen resuming life among other citizens. And he resumed talking. The exact chronology of his intellectual development remains difficult to recover, But by the middle decades of his life, the image preserved across the sources becomes increasingly recognizable. Socrates appears in public spaces, approaching or being approached by people of different kinds, turning ordinary claims into questions. There was no school door to pass through, no fee to pay, no formal curriculum waiting on a tablet. The city itself was the room. The Agora was particularly suited to him because it concentrated human certainty. Everyone there seemed to know something. The craftsman knew how to make. The trader knew what something was worth. The politician believed he knew what the city needed. The poet worked with words admired by others. The general was expected to understand courage. The religious man could speak of piety, and Socrates could ask what any of these things truly meant. A question spoken quietly can alter the atmosphere around it. Imagine two men standing near the edge of the Agora while traffic passes around them. The first answer comes easily. The second requires thought. Then Socrates asks whether the second answer agrees with the first. A pause appears. Nothing spectacular has happened. A potter continues working nearby. Water pours at a fountain. Someone carries fish toward a customer, but one man is no longer as certain as he was a few moments earlier. This pattern, later associated with the Socratic elenchus, would become central to the way his conversations were remembered. He did not simply announce doctrines and wait for others to memorize them. He asked people to state what they believed, then followed the implications of their answers. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? What is virtue? Words familiar enough to be spoken every day became unexpectedly difficult when asked to support the weight people placed upon them. Often the result was not an answer. It was aporia, a state of puzzlement, of recognizing that a path which had seemed obvious no longer led where expected. For some people, this must have been exhilarating. For others, irritating. Athens valued speech, but valuing speech does not necessarily mean enjoying being shown that one's own speech contains contradictions. And Socrates did not reserve his questions for powerless people. That mattered. A city built upon public reputation could be a dangerous place to make confident men look uncertain. Still, his conversations attracted listeners, especially young men with the leisure and curiosity to follow them. They could watch a respected figure answer Socrates confidently and then slowly become entangled in his own claims. There was humor in it. There was intellectual pleasure. There was also the possibility of embarrassment. Socrates insisted that he was not a conventional teacher. This distinction separated him, at least in the portrait preserved by Plato and Xenophon, from the intellectual figures commonly called sophists. The sophists were not a single school with one doctrine. They included prominent figures such as Protagoras, Gorgias, Prodicus, and Hippias, men known for different kinds of teaching and intellectual skill. Some traveled widely. Some taught rhetoric. Their ability to train young men in speech could be particularly valuable in a society where courts and politics depended heavily upon persuasive public argument. They commonly charged fees. Socrates did not. He could speak with someone wealthy or poor without setting a price on the conversation. In Plato's Apology, he would later emphasize that anyone could listen to him and that he had never demanded payment. The difference may have seemed very important to Socrates. It did not necessarily seem as clear to everyone watching from outside. To an Athenian who saw only a strange intellectual surrounded by young men questioning conventional ideas, the boundaries between Socrates and other controversial thinkers could blur. That blurred image would eventually find its way onto a stage. Before it did, the war called again. In 424 BC, Athens sent forces into Boeotia. The campaign culminated near Delium, where the Athenians suffered defeat. Socrates was now around 45. The years between Potidaea and Delium had not transformed him into someone exempt from military obligation. Once again, the man of conversation became the man carrying a shield. The physical world of a hoplite battle was nothing like the clean arrangement of later diagrams. Men stood close. Equipment restricted movement. Dust rose. Commands had to travel through noise. Formations depended upon men maintaining their places beside one another. When a formation broke and an army retreated, fear could travel faster than instruction. At Delium, Athens lost, and once again, later memory placed Socrates inside the retreat. In Plato's dialogues, both Laches and Alcibiades are associated with praise of his conduct. Alcibiades describes Socrates withdrawing with unusual composure, looking around him rather than running blindly, carrying himself in a way that suggested he could defend himself if attacked. The detail is characteristic of the Socrates Plato wants us to see, the same steadiness in war that appears in conversation. Yet even without turning literary portrait into exact battlefield reconstruction, one thing remains secure. Socrates was there. The philosopher, later condemned by fellow Athenians, had risked his body as an Athenian citizen. The man who would one day tell a jury that fear of death should not replace what one believes is right had already stood in situations where death was not an idea. After Delium, he returned again. Athens received its surviving soldiers and continued the war. The rhythm becomes almost strange when viewed across Decades city. Campaign, return, argument, military duty, return. Daily life continuing between events that later historians would isolate and name. For the people living through them, there were no chapter titles. There were only seasons. The Mediterranean summer dried roads and fields. Winter rain returned. Olive oil burned in lamps. Symposium rooms filled with men reclining on couches, while diluted wine circulated from the crater. Musicians could play the aulos. Poetry could be recited. Politics entered conversation because politics was difficult to keep outside any Athenian gathering. Socrates appears in this social world as well. He was remembered as capable of drinking without easily becoming drunk, though simplicity rather than indulgence remained part of his image. At a symposium, he could inhabit the same room as wealthy and fashionable Athenians without becoming much like them. The contrast was visible. Fine cups, reclining couches, perfumed or carefully dressed guests, and Socrates, plain, unbeautiful by conventional standards, interested less in what a man possessed than in what he meant when he called something good. The difference between appearance and interior value would later become one of the most memorable ways Alcibiades described him. Socrates, he said, resembled those Silenus figures that could open to reveal images of gods inside. An ugly container, something unexpected within. Athens had a place for such jokes. It had a place for much sharper jokes too. In 423 BC, only a year after Delium, thousands of Athenians gathered for theatrical competition and watched Aristophanes' Clouds. And on the stage appeared Socrates. Not the historical Socrates preserved carefully behind uncertainties, but a comic Socrates. Aristophanes placed him at the center of a ridiculous intellectual establishment, suspended in a basket, occupied with strange investigations of the heavens and the natural world. The character became associated with clever argument, irreverence toward traditional religion, and the ability to make weaker reasoning defeat stronger reasoning. It was comedy. The stage Socrates combined characteristics associated with different intellectual fashions of the period. It should never be treated as a documentary portrait of what Socrates actually taught. But that does not make the play historically unimportant. Quite the opposite. Socrates was famous enough to be recognized. His face, manner, or reputation had become part of the shared cultural world of Athens. A comic poet could place a version of him before an audience and expect the joke to work. Somewhere among the people who saw or later heard about the play were citizens who would carry an impression of him for years. Socrates himself continued walking through the same city. The theatrical caricature did not drive him into silence. If anything, the contrast between what a person is and what others believe him to be must have become part of the atmosphere surrounding him. In a city where reputation traveled orally, a joke could survive longer than the performance that created it. Words were difficult to retrieve once released. Socrates, of all people, lived almost entirely through words. He wrote no philosophical book. There was no Socratic treatise stored on a shelf to correct a rumor. There was no text he could point toward and say, "Here, this is what I teach." His work existed between people. A question asked beside a workshop lasted as long as memory preserved it. A conversation during a walk could vanish entirely. A joke made about him before thousands could spread. This imbalance would follow him. Yet during the years after Clouds, there was still much life between Socrates and the courtroom that later generations remember so well. He was not walking toward execution with every step. He was living through middle age in a city still consumed by war, surrounded by people whose own futures were unknown. Among the younger men attracted to his company, Alcibiades remained especially brilliant and especially dangerous to predict. He belonged to the highest levels of Athenian society. Beauty, wealth, lineage, ambition, charm, and political talent gathered around him in unusual measure. The man whom Socrates had known in military service would become increasingly central to Athenian politics. Their relationship fascinated later writers because the contrast was almost too perfect. Alcibiades desired distinction in the world. Socrates questioned what distinction was worth. Alcibiades possessed the kind of physical beauty Greek culture admired. Socrates famously did not. Alcibiades moved toward power. Socrates claimed to possess no wisdom worth selling. In Plato's Symposium, these oppositions become part of an elaborate literary portrait. Alcibiades arrives drunk and describes his bewildering attachment to Socrates, a man apparently immune to the attractions that ordinarily gave Alcibiades influence over others. But behind Plato's art lies a historical problem that would grow more serious with time. People remembered who had spent time around Socrates, and the actions of those people could eventually cast shadows backward. For now, Alcibiades had not yet completed the political journey that would make his name so troubling. The war continued. In 422 BC, another campaign took Athenian forces toward Amphipolis. Socrates later named Amphipolis alongside Potidaea and Delium when speaking of his military service. He was around 47. We know much less about his individual experience there. There is no need to fill the silence with invented heroism. It is enough to imagine the recurring physical fact. Again the familiar city fell behind. Again equipment had to be carried. Again Socrates lived among armed men. Again the possibility of death belonged to the day without requiring anyone to discuss philosophy. Amphipolis would be the last of his known military campaigns. When he came home, the man returning to Athens had crossed much of the distance between youth and old age. He had endured long service, witnessed the effects of a war that seemed unwilling to finish, and returned repeatedly to a city where his public identity was becoming increasingly distinct. His appearance grew more familiar. The broad nose, the prominent eyes, the beard, the plain clothing, perhaps bare feet against the ground while others wore sandals. A figure easy to recognize from a distance, and then once close enough the question. Not always a profound sounding question. That was part of the difficulty. Socrates could begin with something everyone believed they understood. Courage, for example, belonged to a society that expected men to fight. Athens honored military bravery. Socrates himself had served in battle. Yet when courage became a subject of conversation, experience alone did not make its meaning simple. Was courage standing your ground? Sometimes retreat was wiser. Was courage endurance? A foolish person could endure something he did not understand. Was courage knowledge? Then knowledge of what? The question opened quietly. The battlefield returned in another form. No spear, no shield, only language, and a person trying to discover whether the thing he had confidently named was as simple as its name. This was where Socrates' life began to gather its unusual unity. The soldier and the questioner were not separate characters taking turns. The same man had stood in formation and later asked what courage meant. He belonged to the civic order and questioned people who claimed to understand virtue. He participated in Athenian life without allowing its most familiar assumptions to remain entirely comfortable. And Athens itself was becoming less comfortable. The years ahead would bring ambitions greater than the campaigns Socrates had already survived. Political confidence would push the city toward decisions whose consequences would reach households, armies, alliances, and reputations. Alcibiades would move closer to the center of events. Religion, politics, scandal, and war would begin to intertwine in ways that no conversation in the Agora could keep neatly apart. Still, on ordinary days, nothing announced the scale of what was approaching. The Agora remained full. Water continued to run from fountains. Craftsmen worked with hands trained through repetition. A potter could turn clay, while men nearby discussed matters of state. Food sellers arranged what they had brought. Public notices waited to be read. Citizens crossed paths without knowing which names history would remember. Socrates moved among them. By now, some people came specifically to hear him. Others probably preferred not to. Young men could linger nearby, listening as someone older and more respected discovered that a simple definition would not survive a few questions. The amusement of the spectators was not always harmless. A person publicly embarrassed rarely remembers only the argument. Resentment, like admiration, accumulates quietly. Socrates continued without a school, without fees, without a written doctrine to distribute. Whatever he believed he was doing, it happened face to face. Perhaps this is why the physical city matters so much to his story. Remove Athens, and something essential disappears. His philosophy was not created in isolation from the noise of citizenship. It breathed the same dusty air as courts and markets. It passed beside temples and workshops. It belonged to a society where speaking well could bring influence and speaking badly could cost a case, where gods were woven into civic ritual, where military service could interrupt intellectual life, and where hundreds of citizens might one day be asked to judge another citizen's words. For now, no such jury had gathered for him. The afternoon light still moved across the Agora as it always had. A conversation ended. Another began. Somewhere beyond the city, ships were being prepared for journeys that would alter Athens more profoundly than anyone standing near Socrates could yet know. Ambition was turning towards Sicily. Alcibiades was rising. Old suspicions and new desires were beginning to share the same streets. And Socrates, having returned from his last known battlefield, remained where he had always been most difficult to ignore, among other people, asking them what they thought they knew. And the people who stopped to answer him could rarely know where the first simple question would lead. The exchange might begin in the open air, surrounded by all the ordinary movement of Athens. Nothing marked it as philosophy. No threshold separated the conversation from the market, the workshop, the fountain, or the road. Someone might be on his way elsewhere. Another might pause because he recognized the strange looking man whose questions had already become familiar in the city. Younger listeners could gather at the edges, curious to see whether confidence would survive another encounter with Socrates. He did not need silence. Athens supplied the background. Water moved into a vessel at a fountain. A craftsman struck material with practiced rhythm. Feet passed over packed earth and stone. Somewhere food was being sold. Somewhere an official matter was being discussed. Somewhere another citizen was trying to persuade someone of something. In a city filled with claims, Socrates asked what those claims meant. One answer could lead gently into another. If a man said that courage meant standing firm against danger, Socrates might ask whether there were situations in which wisdom required retreat. If someone spoke confidently of justice, the word itself could become difficult under examination. Piety, virtue, goodness, knowledge. Familiar terms that seemed solid in ordinary speech could become less certain when their edges were tested. The result was not always a new definition. Often it was the recognition that the old one did not work. Later thinkers would describe this kind of questioning with the term alenchus, an examination or testing, and the condition at which some dialogues arrived where a person no longer knew how to proceed came to be called phas aporia. But those words can make the experience sound more technical than it must have felt. Imagine instead the silence after an answer fails. A moment earlier, someone knew. Now he is thinking. Around him, Athens has not changed at all. The sunlight remains on the wall. The fountain still runs. People still pass. Yet for one person the world has become slightly less certain. Socrates seems to have valued that moment. He did not present himself as the man who possessed all the missing answers. One of the central qualities of the Socratic portrait is precisely his refusal to claim wisdom he did not believe he possessed. The story that gave this refusal a sacred dimension began with an old friend named Chaerephon. According to the account Socrates would later give in Plato's Apology, Chaerephon went to Delphi and asked the oracle whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. The Pythia answered that no one was. The story troubled Socrates because he did not consider himself wise. Delphi stood far from the familiar streets of Athens, beneath the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a sacred place associated with Apollo, and consulted by individuals and cities across the Greek world. Yet the answer that returned from there led, in Plato's account, back into the everyday human spaces. Socrates already inhabited. What could the god mean? Socrates began testing people reputed to possess wisdom. He approached politicians. He examined poets. He spoke with craftsmen. The result, as he later described it, was not the discovery that everyone else knew nothing while Socrates knew everything. It was subtler and more uncomfortable. A politician might possess a reputation for wisdom without possessing the understanding he believed he had. A poet could create something admired without necessarily being able to explain the wisdom others attributed to the work. Craftsmen possessed genuine expertise within their crafts, but success in one domain could tempt a person to assume wisdom in matters beyond it. Socrates gradually understood the oracle in a paradoxical way. His small advantage, if it was an advantage at all, lay in not pretending to know what he did not know. Centuries later, this would be compressed into the famous phrase that Socrates knew that he knew nothing. But the surviving picture is more delicate than the slogan. Socrates did claim to know some things, especially moral convictions. What distinguished him was an awareness of the limits of human knowledge and a persistent suspicion toward confidence unsupported by examination. There was humility in this. There was also danger. A man who quietly admits his own uncertainty may appear modest. A man who reveals yours in front of an audience can appear intolerable. The younger Athenians, who enjoyed listening to Socrates, sometimes imitated the questioning they observed. Plato's Apology acknowledges the pleasure young men took in seeing people examined. Those who discovered that their claims to wisdom could not withstand questioning did not necessarily blame themselves. They could blame Socrates. Resentment accumulated without needing a formal conspiracy. It traveled as conversation travels. A man embarrassed in the Agora told another man what had happened. Someone who had seen clouds already possessed an image into which the story could fit. The strange thinker, the clever arguments, the young men standing nearby, the unsettling treatment of familiar beliefs, separate impressions could merge into a reputation larger than any one conversation. Yet Socrates continued. The divine dimension of his activity, at least as Plato presents it, went beyond the oracle at Delphi. Socrates also spoke of a personals daemonion, a divine sign that had accompanied him since childhood. It did not behave like a teacher whispering doctrines into his ear. In Plato's portrayal, the sign usually restrained him. It appeared when he was about to do something and turned him away. Xenophon's presentation differs somewhat and can make the sign appear more positively directive. So the ancient sources do not give us one perfectly uniform description. What matters is that Socrates understood this experience within a religious world. It should not be translated too quickly into modern language. We cannot diagnose it from a distance of 24 centuries. We do not need to decide that it was conscience, intuition, hallucination, or metaphor. For Socrates, it belonged to the divine. And that makes the later accusation that he introduced unfamiliar divine beings more understandable, even while making the common image of Socrates as a simple atheist much less plausible. The man who would eventually be prosecuted for impiety spoke of Apollo, took the Delphic oracles seriously, and interpreted his questioning as something close to a divine obligation. Religion in Athens was not merely a matter of private belief hidden inside the mind. It occupied the city physically. Temples stood within the civic landscape. Sacrifice accompanied communal life. Festivals altered the rhythm of ordinary days. Processions moved through public space. Meat consumed at sacrifice connected worship with eating and community. Gods belonged to household practice, political identity, theater, warfare, healing, and the calendar itself. Smoke from an altar could rise into the same air through which political argument traveled. A man could pass from trade to worship without entering two separate worlds. Socrates lived inside this environment, questioned within it, and used religious language of his own. The later charge against him would therefore not be a modern debate about whether an individual privately believed in supernatural beings. It would emerge from a city in which relations between citizens, gods, rituals, and communal order were deeply entangled. For many years, however, no court demanded that Socrates defend those relations. There were meals to attend, friends to visit, children growing within his household. At some point, Socrates married Xanthippe. The exact date cannot be recovered securely, though the marriage belongs to the mature period of his life. 3 sons are associated with them: Lamprocles, Sophroniscus, and Menexenus. The family is easy to lose beneath the enormous shadow of the philosopher. Later anecdotes turn Xanthippe into a caricature of the quarrelsome wife, a woman perpetually scolding the serene thinker. Much of that tradition is too late and too shaped by comic storytelling to deserve confidence. What remains is more ordinary and therefore perhaps more human. Socrates had a household. There were children. There were practical needs. Someone had to acquire food, maintain clothing, fetch or arrange water, manage domestic work, and care for young lives, while Socrates spent much of his time in public conversation without charging for it. Philosophical simplicity feels different when viewed from inside a household. The man who could dismiss wealth as secondary still lived among people who required bread. A modest meal might bring grain, olives, vegetables, cheese, perhaps fish, and diluted wine to the household. Oil could burn in a lamp after natural light had faded. The ceramic vessels used for storage and preparation were not philosophical symbols. They were simply things hands reached for every day. A child might hear his father's name spoken in the city long before he understood why other men found him interesting, and Socrates' sons would grow while their father aged. His beard grayed. The unusual face became the face Athenians knew. The bare feet and plain clothing became part of a public identity so familiar that even mockery could depend upon recognition. Yet Socrates could also enter the more refined social world of wealthy Athenians. One of the most famous literary settings in all of Plato places him at the house of the tragedian Agathon after a dramatic victory, in a gathering traditionally dated around 416 BC. The Symposium is a philosophical work, not a transcript of a preserved evening, but the physical world in which Plato places it is historically recognizable. Guests recline around a room. Wine is mixed with water in a crater. Servants move between the men. Cups pass from hand to hand. Conversation replaces the louder drinking the group had apparently endured the previous day. The subject becomes love. Oil lamps throw small areas of light into the room. Ceramic surfaces catch it. Outside, the city continues beyond the walls. But within the gathering, the human voice becomes the center of attention. One man speaks. Then another. Different ideas of love pass through the room. And eventually Socrates speaks too, though characteristically the wisdom attributed to him is framed through another person, the woman Diotima, whose historical status remains uncertain and whom Plato uses in the dialogue as the source of Socrates' account. The conversation rises toward beauty, desire, knowledge, and the human longing for what seems lasting. Yet even here, Plato refuses to leave Socrates suspended in abstraction. The door opens. Alcibiades arrives drunk. The atmosphere changes. He wears the marks of celebration and brings the disorder of the wider world into the carefully arranged conversation. Then he sees Socrates. What follows is one of the richest literary portraits of the philosopher. Alcibiades compares him to Silenus figures, ridiculous or ugly from the outside, concealing divine images within. He speaks of Socrates' resistance to seduction, his endurance at Potidaea, his ability to drink without losing himself, his strange power to make Alcibiades feel ashamed of the life he is living. The scene belongs to Plato's art, but the historical relationship beneath it would become increasingly important. By 416, Alcibiades was no longer merely the young soldier Socrates had known at Potidaea. He had become a major political figure in Athens, brilliant and controversial, capable of inspiring fascination and distrust in almost equal measure. And Athens itself was still at war. For a time, an uneasy peace had interrupted direct conflict with Sparta, but the larger struggle had not truly disappeared. Ambition remained. Rivalries remained. The confidence that had carried Athens through earlier decades had survived enough disaster to become dangerous in a new way. Attention turned westward. Sicily seemed to offer opportunity. In 415 BC, Athens prepared an enormous expedition against Syracuse. The preparations must have transformed the atmosphere of the city. Ships required crews and equipment. Men prepared to leave. Families watched sons, husbands, relatives, and friends move toward the harbor. Political debates surrounded the decision. Alcibiades was among the expedition's leading commanders and among its most enthusiastic advocates. Then, shortly before departure. Something happened in the streets. Herms, sacred stone markers bearing the head of Hermes and placed throughout Athens, were mutilated. The act shocked the city. In a community already preparing a vast military expedition, sacrilege could not be separated neatly from fear about divine favor and civic security. Investigations spread. Accusations multiplied. Stories about private mockeries of the Eleusinian mysteries entered the crisis. Alcibiades was accused in connection with religious offenses. He demanded an immediate trial, but the expedition sailed before the matter was resolved. He was later recalled to face charges. He never returned for the trial. Instead, Alcibiades fled. Eventually, he went to Sparta. The man who had once fought beside Socrates for Athens now advised Athens' enemy. The transformation would have been almost impossible to ignore. Socrates did not accompany him. There is no basis for making Socrates responsible for Alcibiades' choices. Yet association has its own life in public memory. People remembered who spoke with whom. They remembered who had admired whom. A city under strain does not always preserve the careful distinction between influence, friendship, teaching, and responsibility. While Alcibiades' name changed from celebrated Athenian to fugitive and traitor, the Sicilian expedition continued without him. At first, messages traveled back across the sea. Then came disaster. The Athenian campaign against Syracuse collapsed catastrophically. Ships were destroyed or captured. Soldiers attempting retreat were defeated. Large numbers were killed or taken prisoner. The scale of the loss reached far beyond military statistics. The city had sent human beings. The absence returned before many of them did. Households waited for men who would not walk through the door again. The Agora that had once watched preparations for the expedition now absorbed reports of failure. Political confidence had to coexist with grief, fear, anger, and the knowledge that enemies would understand how badly Athens had been weakened. Socrates was entering his mid-50s. The city of his childhood, the rising Athens of building projects and expanding power, was becoming harder to recognize. Yet the daily surface persisted. This is what cities do even during decline. A fountain does not stop because an expedition has failed. Bread must still be made. Children still require care. Courts still hear disputes. Workshops still open. The sun still strikes the Acropolis with no regard for military news. Socrates still speaks. Perhaps now the contrast between his questions and the city's urgency became even sharper. What is good? What is justice? What makes a person fit to guide others? These questions had never been merely decorative. But in a wounded democracy, they could acquire edges no one needed to announce. Political leadership in Athens depended on persuading citizens. Persuasion depended on speech. Yet Socrates repeatedly exposed the possibility that persuasive speech and genuine knowledge were not the same thing. A person could sound certain and be wrong. A crowd could be convinced. A city could choose. Consequences could arrive years later, but Socrates did not respond by offering himself as the ruler who possessed all answers. His persistent claim to limited knowledge prevented that simple escape. Instead, the questions remained. They followed people out of conversations. They entered the memory of younger men. They also gathered enemies. The old hostility described in Plato's later Apology did not originate with Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon in 399. Socrates would tell the jury that he had been surrounded by earlier accusations for many years. Accusations that he investigated things in the sky and beneath the earth, made weaker arguments appear stronger, and taught others to do the same. The shadow of Aristophanes' comic Socrates had not vanished when the theater emptied. A joke can be remarkably durable when it confirms what people are already willing to suspect. And there was another difficulty. Socrates' younger associates did not all become admirable citizens. Alcibiades was the most spectacular example. But he would not be the most politically poisonous. Another name connected with the Socratic circle was Critias. Critias was intelligent, aristocratic, literary, politically ambitious, and destined to become one of the most feared figures in Athens. For the moment, his future too remained unfinished. The city still had years of war ahead. Socrates continued to grow older within it. His way of life seems to have remained strikingly consistent. He did not establish a formal institution. He did not begin charging fees as his reputation grew. He did not withdraw into private scholarship and leave a collection of writings behind. He stayed among people. That choice made his philosophy difficult to preserve and impossible to contain. A written book remains where it is placed. A conversation changes with every person who remembers it. One listener hears humility. Another hears mockery. One sees a man trying to improve his fellow citizens. Another sees a man teaching young people to question their elders. One hears devotion to a divine mission. Another hears unfamiliar talk of divine signs. The same Socrates could become several Socrates in the minds of Athens, and he could not control them all. Perhaps he did not try. In the account Plato would later construct, Socrates' concern was not primarily with reputation, wealth, public honor, bodily comfort. These belonged below another obligation: care for the soul. This phrase can sound distant until it is returned to the streets where it was meant to matter. A merchant counts value. A politician gathers supporters. A young aristocrat thinks about fame. A craftsman takes pride in skill. A father worries about inheritance. Socrates asks what kind of person any of them is becoming. The question does not require contempt for material life. Socrates himself needed food, shelter, clothing, family. Rather, the Socratic challenge was about order. Whether people gave greater care to possessions and reputation than to justice, wisdom, and the condition of their character. The Agora supplied the perfect setting because it made value visible everywhere. Objects had prices. Labor had value. Reputations had value. Votes had value. Military victories had value. And Socrates kept asking about things that could not be weighed on an official scale. What is a good person worth if no one praises him? What is wealth worth if its owner is unjust? What is victory worth if the people who achieve it lose themselves? The surviving dialogues ask such questions in different forms. We should not imagine Socrates delivering them as a sermon while Athens listened silently. His way was more intimate and more persistent. One person, one answer, another question, the city around them. By the final years of the 5th century, Athens had little space left for comfortable illusions. War had consumed resources and lives. Political instability had deepened. Alcibiades' loyalties had shifted more than once. His extraordinary career moving through Athens, Sparta, Persia, and eventually back toward Athenian command before turning again. The city's enemies pressed harder. Socrates was now a man in his 60s. The soldier of Potidaea had become the familiar older figure of the Agora. His body had endured campaigns and decades of walking. His children were part of his household. His reputation had accumulated layers he had never written down. Then, in 406 BC, the war brought another test. Not on a distant battlefield, but inside the civic machinery of Athens itself. The Athenians won a naval battle near the Arginusi Islands. Victory should have brought relief. Instead, a storm and the failure to recover shipwrecked men and the bodies of the dead produced fury in the city. The surviving generals faced the anger of citizens grieving men lost at sea. Socrates happened to be serving at that time among the members of the council drawn from his tribe, Antiochus. For most of his life, he had questioned what justice meant in conversations. Now angry citizens wanted a decision. The pressure was no longer theoretical. The agora and assembly spaces that had carried ordinary argument were filled with something heavier, grief demanding accountability, law confronting anger, and a city exhausted by years of war, trying to decide what justice required before another day could pass. The anger of a city is difficult to measure once grief has entered it. At Arginusi, Athens had won. Enemy ships had been defeated, and for a city that had endured so many reversals, victory should have brought something close to relief. But the sea had not allowed the day to end cleanly. A storm followed the battle. Wrecked ships and men remained in the water. Rescue and recovery failed. Survivors returned carrying not only news of victory, but the knowledge that fellow Athenians had been left behind. Families did not receive military strategy. They received absence. Some waited for bodies that never came home. Some imagined men still alive in the water while ships moved away. Others wanted to know who had been responsible. The generals became the focus of public fury. In ordinary times, law could seem like stone, something already shaped, already standing. Under pressure, its fragility became easier to see. The proposal before the Athenians was to judge the generals together rather than individually. a procedure that raised serious legal objections, and by the strange arrangement of civic rotation, Socrates found himself inside the machinery of the decision. His tribe, Antiochus, was serving its period in the council. Ancient sources remember Socrates as one of those who resisted putting the collective procedure to an unlawful vote. The precise details of his formal position that day are disputed, and we need not make him the solitary master of the assembly. What matters is simpler. Pressure was intense. The crowd wanted action. Socrates did not believe the proposed procedure was lawful. He refused to cooperate with it. The scene feels very different from a quiet conversation in the Agora, yet something familiar remains within it. For years he had asked whether justice changed when convenience demanded it. Now the question had stopped being conversational. Men were angry. The dead were recent. Political pressure had weight. There was no comfortable distance from consequence. Socrates stood inside the civic system and discovered that asking what was right was much easier when no one was demanding an immediate answer. The generals were eventually tried together. 6 were condemned and executed. Athens had punished its commanders after a victory. The sea beyond the city remained unchanged by the decision. Waves continued against shorelines. Wind crossed the water where men had vanished. Somewhere in Athens, mourning continued whether the generals lived or died. Socrates returned to private life. There is no evidence that the episode transformed him into a political leader. He did not build a faction around his resistance. He did not turn the moment into a public career. He went back to the streets. That may be one of the strangest things about him. Again and again, moments that could have redirected an ordinary life seemed to dissolve back into conversation. The city demanded military service, and he served. The city demanded civic participation, and he participated. Then he returned to questioning people. But Athens no longer had much time left in the war. The conflict that had begun when Socrates was in his late 30s had consumed nearly 3 decades. Children born at its beginning were now adults. Men who had once imagined a short struggle had grown gray inside it. Fields had been invaded, fleets destroyed and rebuilt, alliances changed, political confidence broken, and restored and broken again. The city had survived so much that survival itself could begin to feel permanent. It was not. In 404 BC, Athens finally lost. The end arrived not with philosophical clarity, but with exhaustion. Sparta prevailed. Athenian power collapsed. The great naval empire that had shaped the world of Socrates, adulthood was gone. Ships that had carried Athenian influence across the Aegean could no longer give the city the same sense of distance and protection. The walls that had helped connect Athens to the sea stood beneath the authority of victors. For the people who remembered the confidence of earlier decades, the change must have been almost physical. The Acropolis remained. The Agora remained. The same streets still connected the same parts of the city. yet political space had shifted beneath them. Stone can preserve the appearance of continuity long after human arrangements have changed. A temple does not lean because a constitution falls. A fountain continues to release water after a government disappears. People still wake hungry. Bread still needs grain. Oil lamps still need oil. And so the city that had lost a war woke into another day. But the political order was not the same. A group later remembered as the 30 came to power under Spartan influence. Among their most prominent and severe figures was Critias. For Socrates, that name carried an uncomfortable familiarity. Critias had belonged to the wider Socratic circle. He was educated, aristocratic, intelligent, and politically ambitious. His later actions would make him one of the most feared men associated with the oligarchic regime. The connection between him and Socrates would not disappear simply because Socrates had not designed Critias' politics. Memory rarely respects such clean boundaries. People remembered that Critias had spent time around Socrates. They remembered Alcibiades too. One had betrayed Athens in a spectacular career of shifting loyalties. The other now stood near the center of a violent oligarchic government. To someone already suspicious of Socrates and the young men who gathered around him, these names could appear less like coincidence and more like evidence. But the actual relationship between questioning and political behavior cannot be reduced so easily. Socrates did not command Critias. He did not send Alcibiades to Sparta. He did not establish a political school whose graduates were instructed to overthrow democracy. The fact that controversial men had associated with him would nevertheless become part of the atmosphere around his name. And atmosphere can matter almost as much as proof when a society is wounded. The 30 governed harshly. Political enemies were removed. Property was seized. Men were executed. Fear entered civic life in ways different from wartime fear. An enemy army is visible. A government that can summon a citizen and order him to participate in injustice brings danger closer to the household door. At some point during the rule of the 30, Socrates received such an order. Plato's Apology preserves his later account. He and 4 other men were summoned and instructed to bring Leon of Salamis from Salamis, so that Leon could be put to death. The order placed Socrates in a very different kind of formation from the hoplite lines of his younger years. There was no battlefield, no shield, no enemy standing across from him. Only authority. 5 men were told what to do. The others went. Socrates did not. He went home. The simplicity of the action is part of its force. No speech survives from the moment. No dramatic confrontation is needed. He refused to become an instrument of an act he regarded as unjust, and then he returned to his own house. Later, he would tell the jury that he believed he might have been killed for this if the rule of the 30 had lasted longer. The regime did not last, but Leon did not survive, and the episode left behind a quiet symmetry in Socrates' life. Under democracy, during the Arginusi affair, he had resisted pressure when he believed lawful procedure was being violated. Under oligarchy, he refused an order to participate in the seizure of a man marked for death. He did not fit comfortably into the simple image of either democrat or oligarch. That would not necessarily help him later. A person who refuses all easy political categories can be distrusted by more than one side. The streets themselves carried the consequences of the regime. Men disappeared. Property changed hands. Families adapted their behavior to uncertainty. Private conversations became more careful when politics could become dangerous. The Agora, once filled with the ordinary collisions of commercial and civic life, existed under a government that had narrowed the meaning of citizenship and concentrated power. Socrates still lived in the same city. He was now in his mid-60s. The distance between the boy from Alapeak and the older man moving through defeated Athens had become enormous. Though he had not traveled far from home in the geographical sense, he had seen the city at its most confident. He had watched stone rise on the Acropolis. He had served in campaigns when Athenian power seemed capable of extending far beyond Attica. He had seen plague. He had watched political ambition carry Athens toward Sicily. He had known men who became symbols of both brilliance and betrayal. He had lived long enough for the city of his youth to lose the war that defined most of his adulthood. Still, his manner of life did not become grander. There was no retreat into a wealthy old age, no official chair of philosophy, no building carrying his name. He continued to possess what he had always possessed, most reliably his voice, his body, the streets, and other people willing or unwilling to answer him. The 30 fell in 43 BC. Democratic forces returned. Athens restored its democracy and, remarkably, chose a broad policy of reconciliation rather than unlimited revenge. An amnesty helped restrict prosecution for many acts connected with the oligarchic period. This did not make memory disappear. A legal settlement can prevent certain prosecutions. It cannot force people to forget. Citizens who returned from exile remembered why they had left. Families remembered the dead. People remembered Critias. And anyone thinking about Critias could remember the older man whose conversations he had once attended. The restored democracy, therefore, inhabited the same physical Athens with a new political caution. This was not the exuberant city of Socrates' youth. It was a city that had survived itself. Perhaps there is a particular quiet that comes after long public disaster, not silence exactly. Markets reopen. Officials resume duties. Legal procedures return. Ships still move through the harbor. People repair houses and relationships. Children play among adults who carry memories they cannot see. But confidence is different after defeat. The assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday has been weakened. The stones remain, yet human arrangements reveal how temporary they are. Socrates, who had spent decades testing what people believed they knew, now walked through a city that had been taught uncertainty by events rather than questions. And still the questions continued. Young men listened. This alone could be troubling. Every society depends partly upon the willingness of one generation to teach the next what deserves respect. Athens had just endured a period in which some highly educated, ambitious men had rejected or manipulated the city's institutions with terrible consequences. Against that background, an old man encouraging younger people to examine conventional claims could appear less harmless than it might have decades earlier. What exactly did he teach them? That question would become central. Socrates' own answer was difficult because he denied being a teacher in the ordinary sense. He accepted no fees. He claimed no curriculum. He did not gather students into a formal school. People listened because they wished to listen. Some stayed near him longer than others, some imitated him. But Athens did not necessarily care about the technical distinction between a teacher and a man whose presence changed the thinking of younger citizens. Nor did everyone admire the change. To Socrates, questioning might be care for the soul. To a father watching his son become contemptuous of respected men, it could look like corruption. To a politician made foolish in public, it could look like arrogance. To someone who remembered clouds, it could look like the same old intellectual danger Aristophanes had already mocked years earlier. The accusations surrounding Socrates therefore grew from several layers of memory. The first layer was comic. The strange thinker investigating things above and below the earth. The clever speaker associated with making weak arguments strong. Then came social irritation. The man who questioned respected people. The young listeners who enjoyed watching. Then political association. Alcibiades, Critias. Then religious unease. The personal divine sign. The unusual language about his divine mission. None of these alone provides a complete explanation for what would happen. Together, they formed a reputation, and reputations, once formed, often become easier to inherit than to examine. Socrates himself understood this. Years later, when facing his accusers, he would distinguish between the men formally prosecuting him and the older accusations that had surrounded him for much longer. Those older voices were more difficult to answer because many had no single face. A rumor has no body to cross-examine. It can sit quietly in the mind for decades. The irony is difficult to miss. Socrates had spent much of his life asking people not to accept unexamined claims. Yet his own identity had become surrounded by claims repeated so often that they felt familiar. Still, no formal charge had yet brought his life to its final crisis. He was an old man living in a recovering city. Home life continued. Xanthippe remained part of his household. His sons were still young enough that, at the end of his life, he would speak of them as children needing guidance. This too complicates the marble image. The famous philosopher was also a father whose family would have to live with the consequences of his choices. A child does not experience philosophy as posterity does. A child experiences whether a father comes home, whether there is food, whether adults are worried, whether voices become quieter when certain names are mentioned. The sources do not allow us into the private emotions of Socrates' household during these years, so we should leave the door partly closed. Outside it, Athens returns to its routines. Morning begins with movement toward water and work. At the Agora, official business resumes under democratic institutions. Jurors are selected, citizens gather, measurements regulate trade. Public records give civic life material form. Somewhere, Socrates can still be encountered. By now he has lived long enough that many younger Athenians cannot remember a city without him. He has become almost part of its human landscape, the Acropolis above, the Agora below, and the old, strange-faced man walking between people. He does not possess the timeless serenity later art will give him. Age has weight. Military campaigns remain in the history of the body even when wounds are invisible. Decades of walking hard ground shape feet and joints. Gray enters hair. Skin changes beneath Attic sun, yet ancient descriptions continue to emphasize his endurance. Plain clothing. Little concern for physical luxury. The ability to tolerate discomfort that others found unpleasant. Such qualities had once been impressive in military camps. In old age, they became part of the recognizable simplicity of his way of living, and his central concern in the Platonic portrait remained stubbornly unchanged. People took care of money. They took care of reputation. They took care of political influence. They took care of their bodies. But did they take equal care over what kind of people they were becoming? The city could be rebuilt politically. Could character be rebuilt so easily? A democracy could be restored by decree and agreement. Could citizens restore trust? Could the men who had suffered under oligarchy live beside those who had remained? Could old resentments be contained simply because law asked them to be? These questions belong naturally to a wounded polis, even without Socrates asking them aloud. Athens itself had become philosophical terrain. The rebuilding of public life required choices about memory. Too much vengeance could restart civil conflict. Too much forgetting could feel like betrayal of the dead. The amnesty balanced uneasily between them. Socrates lived inside that balance. His connection with Critias could be remembered, but the political past could not simply be prosecuted without regard to the reconciliation. This is one reason the later trial should not be reduced to the claim that Athens wanted revenge for his political associations and invented religious charges as an obvious disguise. The reality is more subtle. The formal charges that would come were real charges within Athenian civic and religious categories, but they came into a city with memories, and memory shaped how a man was seen. By 399 BC, Socrates was about 70. 70 years is long enough for a city to become several cities. The Athens of his birth had lived in the aftermath of victory over Persia. The Athens of his youth had grown in wealth and ambition. The Athens of his middle age had fought Sparta. The Athens of his later years had endured epidemic disease, imperial overreach, military catastrophe, oligarchy, civil conflict, and restoration. Through all those transformations, Socrates had remained within the same broad civic world. Perhaps that continuity made him more unsettling, not less. He remembered too much. Others remembered him too well. There were men who had grown old while hearing his name. There were younger men who had heard stories before ever meeting him. There were citizens who knew the comic version, those who knew the soldier, those who knew the questioner, those who knew the associate of Alcibiades and Critias, those who saw the pious man serving Apollo, those who heard only strange talk of a private divine sign. No single image displaced the others. Then 3 names emerged from the city: Meletus, Anytus, Lycon. Meletus would become the formal accuser, most visibly associated with the case. Anytus carried greater political and social weight. Lycon represented another strand of opposition. Their precise private motives cannot be recovered with certainty. And the account Socrates later gives of them remains his side of the confrontation. What can be recovered is the accusation itself. The old man who had spent decades questioning his fellow citizens would be required to answer questions imposed by the city. He was accused of corrupting the young. He was accused of not recognizing the gods the city recognized. He was accused of introducing other, new divine things. The language entered formal procedure. Words that had floated for years as suspicion now acquired legal weight. Before a trial could occur, there were preliminary steps. The charge belonged to the sphere overseen by the Archon Basileus, the magistrate whose duties included religious matters. And this is where Plato places one of his most quietly fitting scenes. Socrates, on his way through the legal process of a case concerning impiety, encounters Euthyphro. Their conversation turns toward piety itself. What is it? How does one know an action is pious? Do the gods love what is pious because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? The dialogue is Plato's literary creation, not a stenographic record of a chance encounter. Yet the setting captures something essential about the whole Socratic life. Even with a prosecution forming around him, the question remains more interesting than panic. The city says piety matters. Socrates asks what piety is. Athens is preparing to judge him. He is still examining the meaning of the words through which judgment will come. Around the legal buildings, ordinary life continues. Someone arrives carrying documents. Another waits for his own case. Jurors elsewhere prepare for duties that have nothing to do with Socrates. Water is poured, feet cross stone, a man sells food, a craftsman opens his workshop. The sun moves slowly across the city that Socrates has known for nearly 70 years. He has walked these streets as a boy, a soldier, a husband. A father, a comic target, a troublesome questioner, a citizen under democracy, and a citizen under oligarchy. Now he walks them as an accused man. There is still no prison wall around him, no cup of poison, no final gathering of friends. Those remain ahead. For the moment, the old man moves through Athens beneath the same open sky, while somewhere within the civic offices his name has ceased to belong only to rumor and conversation. It has entered a case. And once a name enters the machinery of a court, even a familiar street begins to feel slightly altered. Socrates had spent most of his life approaching other people with questions. Now the city would place him before hundreds of citizens and ask whether the life he had lived among them had become dangerous. The charges were simple enough to state. He was accused of corrupting the young. He was accused of failing to recognize the gods acknowledged by the city. He was accused of introducing new divine things. Behind those words stood decades of memory. The comic figure from Aristophanes, the young men who had followed him, Alcibiades, Critias, the strange divine sign, the embarrassment of men who believed themselves wise, the irritation of fathers, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and anyone who had watched certainty dissolve beneath a few questions. Yet none of these memories alone constituted the trial. The formal charges had to be answered, and so in 399 BC, Socrates appeared before an Athenian jury. The setting should not be imagined as a modern courtroom with a judge seated above lawyers and spectators arranged in ordered rows. Athenian justice belonged to a different civic world. Large juries of male citizens heard cases directly. Selection depended upon civic procedures involving identification tablets and mechanisms of allotment. Speeches were timed. Water flowed through a clepsydra, marking the allotted period in a way that made time itself part of the legal process. While someone spoke, water disappeared. A case advanced as the vessel emptied. For a man who had spent nearly 70 years inside Athens, there is something almost painfully fitting in that image. The city now measured his defense in water. We do not possess the sounds of the actual courtroom. We do not know exactly where every juror sat or what expression crossed each face. We do not hear the cough of a man waiting in the crowd, the movement of sandals, the small scrape of metal as voting equipment was handled. But the physical world remains easy to sense. Stone beneath feet, dry air, voices carrying across an open civic space. The presence of hundreds of citizens who would soon decide whether another citizen should live. Socrates stood before them without the polished identity of a professional advocate. Plato's Ars Apology gives us the most famous version of his defense, but it is not a stenographic transcript. Xenophon preserved another account. The exact words spoken on that day cannot be recovered. What survives through Plato is the shape of a man refusing to become someone else merely because death has entered the room. He begins by distinguishing himself from the image that has followed him for years. He is not the natural philosopher floating in Aristophanes' basket. He does not claim secret knowledge of the heavens and the earth. He is not a sophist selling instruction. He has never charged people to listen to him. Then he returns to the old story of Delphi, Chaerephon, the oracle, the claim that no one was wiser, and Socrates' long attempt to understand what that could mean. He tells the jurors about questioning those with reputations for wisdom and discovering that human beings could be most mistaken, precisely when they were most certain that they knew. There is no grand doctrine offered in exchange, only the uncomfortable suggestion that awareness of ignorance may be wiser than confidence without understanding. The jurors listening to him were not abstractions. Some may have known him personally. Some may have watched him in the Agora. Some may have heard stories for decades. Some may already have disliked him before Meletus ever filed the charge. Socrates understood that the older accusations were harder to answer than the men standing before him now. How does anyone cross-examine a reputation? A rumor heard in childhood has no mouth. A joke remembered from a comedy has no body. A father's resentment passes quietly into a son. Socrates could answer Meletus. He could not summon every person who had ever said that Socrates taught young men how to defeat justice with clever words. And still he argued. According to Plato's account, he questioned Meletus himself. If Socrates corrupted the young, who improved them? Meletus' answer broadened until almost everyone in Athens seemed capable of improving young people except Socrates. The logic became another Socratic examination performed under circumstances where the stakes were no longer merely embarrassment. Socrates also challenged the religious accusation. How could someone believe in divine signs or divine things while believing in no divinity at all? Again, the argument was less a confession of conventional piety than an attempt to show contradiction in the charge as framed. But the most revealing part of the Platonic defense comes when Socrates explains what he would do if the jury offered to release him on the condition that he stop questioning people. He says he would not stop. His activity, as Plato presents it, has become an obligation bound to the divine. He must continue asking citizens why they care so much for wealth, reputation, and status while giving less attention to wisdom, truth, and the condition of the soul. This is where the long life behind him begins to gather into one quiet line. The boy from Alapeque, the soldier at Potidea, the man at Delium, the older citizen who resisted unlawful pressure, the man who refused the 30, the questioner in the Agora. None of them can easily be separated now. Socrates does not say that survival is worthless. He says something subtler and more demanding. A man cannot know that death is the worst thing. To fear it as though one possesses certain knowledge of what follows would itself be a kind of false wisdom. He does know, or believes he knows, that acting unjustly is wrong. So between an unknown evil and an injustice he believes he understands. He chooses not to abandon the latter merely to escape the former. The water in the clepsydra keeps falling. Outside the court, Athens continues. Someone negotiates over food. A jar is filled. A child is called home. Sunlight changes against walls. The city does not hold its breath simply because one man is defending his life. That may be one of the deepest differences between an individual death and the life of a city. To the individual, death occupies everything. To the city, another day continues around it. Eventually the speech is ended. The jurors voted. Socrates was found guilty. The margin does not appear to have been overwhelming, but the exact reconstruction of the vote should be treated carefully. What mattered now was that the first decision had been made. In Athenian procedure, the penalty still had to be determined. The prosecution sought death. Socrates was allowed to offer an alternative. And here, once again, he refused the role expected of him. A condemned man might propose a punishment that showed submission. Socrates instead suggested, with unmistakable irony, that if his life had benefited Athens, as he believed it had, he deserved maintenance at public expense in the Prytaneum, an honor associated with those who had served the city well. One can almost feel the temperature of the room change. The man has just been found guilty. He is being asked what penalty he deserves, and he answers with an honor. Later, he agrees to a financial penalty supported by friends. But the image has already been created. To admirers, it can look like extraordinary integrity. To an irritated juror, extraordinary arrogance. The second vote brought the death sentence. Even then, execution did not immediately follow. Something older than the trial intervened. Athens maintained a sacred mission to Delos connected with Apollo. Each year a sacred ship made the voyage, and during the period between its departure and return the city observed ritual purity. Executions were suspended. By chance, the sacred mission had begun around the time of Socrates' trial. And so the city that had condemned him could not yet kill him. His life entered a strange interval. A ship somewhere on the Aegean now helped determine how many mornings remained. Wind mattered, sea conditions mattered, distance mattered. The same Athens that had measured his speech in water now measured the remainder of his life through a vessel moving across the sea. Socrates was imprisoned. The exact building is uncertain. Archaeologists have associated a structure near the southwestern area of the Agora with the state prison. But the identification is not secure enough to call any surviving room his cell. There is no need to know the exact wall. The important boundary is simpler. For most of his life, Socrates had belonged to open space, roads, military camps, courtyards, symposium rooms. The Agora. Now movement narrowed. A door closed behind him. His friends could still visit. Conversation did not end. Perhaps nothing could have been more characteristic. Days that might have been spent counting the hours became days of continued questioning. Plato places one of those conversations in the of Crito. Crito arrives with the possibility of escape. Money is available. Friends are willing. There are places outside Athens where Socrates could go. The prison does not have to be the final boundary. All that is required is consent. For many listeners, the obvious question arrives immediately. Why not leave? The judgment has been unjust. The sentence is death. Why should an innocent man cooperate with it? Plato's dialogue refuses an easy answer. Socrates argues that one should not answer injustice with injustice. Through the famous imagined speech of the laws, the dialogue explores the relationship between a citizen and the legal order under which he has lived. We should not treat every line as the transcript of a historical prison conversation, but the choice itself belongs to the ancient tradition surrounding Socrates. He did not escape. The man who had spent his life asking people to examine what they believed did not abandon his own principles simply because following them had become expensive. There was another cost too. Outside the prison waited a household. Xanthip, his sons, the youngest still a child. The philosophical image can make the decision look clean. Human life rarely is. To remain meant that a wife would lose her husband. Children would lose their father. Friends would lose the man around whom so many conversations had gathered. Socrates' refusal to flee was not an abstract gesture made in an empty universe. Other people would live inside its consequences. The surviving sources do not allow us to reconstruct every private conversation, so we should not invent them. We can simply allow the silence around the family to remain. Days pass. Morning enters the prison. Visitors come. Evening returns. The sacred ship remains away. Perhaps news of its progress moves through the city, perhaps not. For Socrates, the important fact is simply that it has not yet returned. Then at last it does. The ritual prohibition ends. The execution can proceed. Plato's Phaedo gives us the most famous account of the final day, and Plato himself carefully indicates that he was not present. The story is told through Phaedo, one of the men associated with Socrates. Friends gather early. The atmosphere is not theatrical in the ordinary sense. There is grief, but also conversation. Socrates has been freed from his chains. The relief in his legs after restraint becomes an occasion for reflection on the strange closeness of pleasure and pain. Even now, ordinary sensation becomes thought. Xanthip is there with one of their young children. She cries out when the friends arrive, overwhelmed by the reality that this will be the final day. Socrates asks Crito to have her taken home. She leaves, and the men remain. For much of the day, according to Plato, they speak about the soul and death. A person encountering the scene only through its subject might expect darkness. Instead, the rhythm is surprisingly calm. Arguments unfold. Questions are asked. Objections are raised. The man awaiting death does not demand silence from those who disagree with him. He asks them to continue examining. The old habit remains intact until almost the end. Outside, daylight moves gradually across Athens. The city he has known for nearly 70 years has entered another ordinary day. At the Agora, trade and civic business continue. Water runs. Food is prepared. People who have never spoken with Socrates pursue matters that seem important. On the Acropolis, stone receives the same sun that touched it when Socrates was a child. Somewhere beyond the city, roads leave Attica in directions he will never travel again. Inside the prison, the hours shorten. Eventually the official comes. In Plato's account, even the man responsible for administering the execution is moved. He tells Socrates that he has found him different from other condemned prisoners and does not blame him for what is about to happen. Then the poison is brought. Tradition identifies it with hemlock, though it is safest to think of it as the poisonous preparation used for execution rather than insist upon a modern clinical certainty about every ingredient. Socrates asks what he must do. The instructions are practical. Drink. Walk until the legs become heavy. Then lie down. The simplicity is almost unbearable. No sword, no dramatic public spectacle, a cup, a few movements, a body obeying the chemistry of something it has swallowed. According to Plato, Socrates takes the cup without trembling or losing color. He drinks. His friends can no longer maintain the composure they have tried to preserve. Some weep openly. Socrates rebukes the outburst gently, reminding them that he had sent the women away partly to avoid such lamentation. Then he walks. The same feet that crossed Alapeak as a child. The same feet remembered on campaign. The same feet that had carried him through the Agora, perhaps often bare against the ground. Now they begin to grow heavy. He lies down. The attendant checks his body. Feeling disappears from the feet and begins to move upward. We should not rush this moment. For almost 70 years, the body has carried one man through one city. It has endured cold at Potidea, military service at Amphipolis, heat and dust, rain, age, long conversations, longer walks. Now sensation withdraws slowly through the same body. The room grows quieter. Socrates' face is covered. Then he uncovers it once more. He speaks to Crito. They owe a rooster to Asclepius. He asks that the debt be paid and not forgotten. Crito says it will be done. He asks whether there is anything else. There is no further answer. The meaning of the rooster has never been settled. Asclepius was a god of healing, and later readers have often wanted the final offering to mean that death itself was a cure. Perhaps, but that interpretation belongs to those who came after. Socrates left no explanation. It may be better to let the final sentence remain what it is: a debt, a request that it be remembered, a small practical obligation spoken at the boundary of death. The man who spent his life asking questions leaves one final question behind without even asking it. Then the room becomes still. Yet Athens does not. There is no moment when the city freezes around the death of Socrates. The Agora does not empty. The fountains do not stop. The Acropolis does not lose its light. Xanthippe continues into a life that the surviving tradition tells us far less about. His sons continue growing. His friends leave the prison carrying memories that will not remain private. And this is where something unusual begins. Socrates wrote nothing. No philosophical book bearing his name waits to be opened after his death. No final manuscript explains what he intended. Instead, other people begin to write. Xenophon, Antisthenes, Aeschines, Phaedo, Euclides, different memories, different Socrates, different attempts to preserve a man whose philosophy had existed primarily between human beings. The absence of writing, which once allowed rumor to shape his reputation, now creates another kind of survival. Everyone who remembers him must recreate him. Plato will place him into dialogues. Xenophon will defend his character. Others will establish traditions of their own. Students of later generations will encounter a man they can no longer meet in the Agora. They will have only voices preserved by other voices. And perhaps that is strangely appropriate. Socrates had never made answers easy to possess. Why should Socrates himself be easy to possess? Even today, the historical man remains partly behind the figures created by those who knew him or claimed his memory. We see him through layers. The comic mask, the Platonic questioner, the Xenophontic moral figure, the later marble face, and somewhere behind them, the citizen born at Alapeque around 470 BC, who grew old while Athens changed around him. The city outlived him. It outlived the men who condemned him. It outlived the democracy that judged him and the oligarchy he had resisted. Centuries passed. Buildings fell. Statues broke. Languages changed. Empires arrived over the same ground. Yet one of the quiet habits of that old Athenian proved remarkably difficult to bury. A person makes a confident claim. Another person asks why. An answer comes. Then another question. That is all. No temple is required. No army. No wealth. No written system. Only enough patience to remain with uncertainty for a little longer. Perhaps somewhere in Athens, not long after Socrates' death, a conversation began without him. Two people stood in the shade. Someone remembered something he had once asked. Another disagreed with the answer. The city continued around them. Water moved into a jar. A craftsman returned to his work. Footsteps crossed the Agora. The stone above them warmed beneath the Attic sun. And the question remained,